Hello, my name is Patricia Murrieta, and on behalf also of my colleagues David Cooper and Ian Gregory, I would like to introduce you today to the work that we have been carried out in the project that is called Spatial Humanities, Text, Geographic Information Systems and Places. And this is a project that is taking place at Lancaster University at the History Department. And it is an initiative funded by the European Research Council that will last for 5 years, and we just started a few months ago. So for the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to walk you through the background of the project. I'm going to show you a little bit what we have been doing, and I want to show you also an example on the methodologies that we have been developing so far for the analysis of text. Right, so as many of you probably already know, there has been a really a good amount of really successful projects that have been looking to incorporate what is called unstructured text. This is to say books, newspapers, or official reports, for instance, into geographic information systems. But for those of you that haven't really come across geographic information systems, they can be defined in a very simple way as a form of database in which each data is linked to a particular location. And with this kind of software, you can map, you can create maps, for instance, or you can visualize also locations, spatial data sets, and so on. But the real interesting thing about GIS do not lie in its mapping capabilities or visualizing capabilities. The real power of GIS lies in its capacity of carrying out spatial analysis. And what I mean by that is basically the capacity of analyzing the spatial relationships between those particular data sets that I was telling you before, or between each piece of information and features in the landscape, for instance, or features in the real world. So some of the projects that I was telling you before, or the majority of them, use automated processing language techniques in order to identify what is called proper nouns. And then they narrow down that search into place names using a gazetteer. And what the gazetteer does is to assign coordinates to those places, which makes, in a way, really easy to integrate then this information into a geographic information system. But we really believe in this project that the challenge do not only lie on the georeference of text. We really believe that the challenge lies on the development of methods and techniques that will allow us to understand the geographies within those texts and the realities underlying those geographies. So the work that we have been doing, the Spatial Humanities project, is basically to integrate corpus linguistic techniques with spatial technology in order to develop not only formal but also exploratory methods in order to integrate text into GIS, but to carry out spatial analysis. And this approach, we believe, that will allow us to solve very important questions, such as what places is this corpus talking about, what is being said about different places, and how has the way places are represented in the corpus actually changed over time. And these are very general questions in a way that can be addressed and can be solved with spatial analysis. But there are also more particular questions that we can address depending on the corpus that we are analyzing, as I will show you in a bit in an example. So how are we actually doing this? So once you have digitized the corpus that you want to work with and you have marked it up, you can use a fantastic tool that our team in Corpus Linguistics actually built for our project. And this tool is called Place Name Proximity Search, and what it basically allows you is to create queries regarding that particular corpus. So you can ask a simple question such as, give me all the places that are mentioned in this corpus. And the result from this tool will be a series of tables that can be very easily and very straightforward directly input into GIS. You can also build more complex queries such as give me all the places that are related to the word war, or to other particular series of words, for instance. I'm not going to go really into the detail of this particular tool because we have today with us the team that actually built this fantastic piece of software. And they are going to explain to us in the next talk a little bit more about it, but mainly about the challenges and issues that this kind of approach supposes for spatial technologies. But what I want to do next is also to show you one of the examples that we have been working so far. And this example contains basically a corpus that is called HisPop, or the HisPop material. And these are basically the Registrar General reports and census data from the 1800s to 1946. And this is quite an important data set because it contains all the births, deaths, and marriages that happened in the UK during that particular period. And this is a corpus that is available online. It was also an initiative by several institutions, and we're very grateful with them because they allow us to use their data set for our own project. The particular data set that we were interested on were the annual reports of the Registrar General from Victorian times. And the reasons for this are several, but today I want to explain you more about the methodologies that we have been used to analyze text, through spatial analysis with this particular data set. So, as I was telling you before, one of the questions that we addressed at the very beginning and that we were very interested to solve was precisely what places is this corpus talking about. And in this particular case, what places were mentioned in the Registrar General from 1850 to 1910. So this is something that you can do at different scales. And the first thing that we did was precisely to create a world map in which we display all the places that have been mentioned in the Registrar General for this particular date. And what we realized about this data set that was actually quite interesting was precisely that the RG was not only mentioning, although it is a corpus related to UK data, was not only mentioning places on the UK, but it was actually mentioned also places all around the world and also many different countries. So other interesting questions from that can also be addressed, such as what is the RG actually saying about other countries? And this is a question that I'm not going to solve right now because we are still at very early stages of the project. But what I want to show you about this is that you can also address other questions that are quite interesting for us, just creating a very simple map. So you can also go at a more regional scale, and by creating this very simple map, you can start to devise or to tell just part of the story. But one interesting question that can be addressed here is precisely that we start to see some spatial maybe clustering, and we actually ask which were the places most mentioned. So to answer this particular question, we create another very simple map looking at the frequencies and mentions of places. And what we realized from this map was precisely that they were particular places that were actually most mentioned than others. And looking at this map as well, we addressed the question, was the RG focusing more in urban places? Precisely because one of the things that we realized is that maybe that the places were most mentioned also correspond to the most urban ones. So, taking into account also another piece of information that we have from another project, which was basically the population of the UK, we divided all the districts per urbanity class. This is to say, through a technique that is quite common in geography, based on the population, we divide all the districts in the UK in urban classes. And these classes were from 1 being the most rural to 8 being the most urban. And what we did was basically just to count the total mentions that we have per class in each of the districts. So if there was really an urban bias, we will expect to see more of the mentions in these particular classes, which was something that really didn't happen. It is still, so we had to reject our hypothesis that there was an urban bias. But this didn't matter. I mean, there is also a very interesting case in here that we still have to answer. Why are these particular mentions more focused on urban classes as well? But the most important fact to look at in the bigger picture of this exercise was precisely that through this technique we were capable of solving a particular question, or this particular question in this case, also addressing other more interesting ones as well. So another of the questions that we wanted to solve it as well was, what is the corpus saying about places? And for this, to solve this particular question, we took two different paths. This is not to say that they are the only paths that are available or that you can actually follow to solve this question. This only means that these are particular methodologies that we are looking at in this specific case. So the first path we took was the identification of place name clusters, and then going back to do collocation analysis on those place name clusters. And what I mean by that is basically to analyze the spatial distribution of those mentions that I showed you before. This is to say in terms of the frequencies of mentions, but also in terms of their spatial location. And you can ask at this moment, why is this clustering important? Well, in spatial analysis, clustering is particularly important because the shape that a distribution takes might tell you loads of things about the underlying processes that are taking place in that distribution, and therefore it can point you out that there is something else to explain. So the first step in this methodology was precisely to answer the question, is this particular distribution really clustered or not? So to answer that, we carried out a very simple statistical spatial analysis that is called average nearest neighbor. And I'm not going to bore you with the statistics behind it, but it will be enough to say that it was positive in terms of clustering. So we could establish that, yeah, that this distribution was actually clustered. But we didn't really only want to know if it was clustered or not. We also wanted to identify the particular clusters or placings that were forming clusters. So for that, what we did was to carry out a different technique that is that was combining kernel density analysis with another technique that is called autocorrelation, spatial autocorrelation analysis, and we created this particular map. And what this map is depicting is the densities or the statistically significant densities of mentions that were happening in particular areas. So the red areas are basically the most mentioned areas in the whole of the UK. And from this technique, we identify 8 different clusters of place names, and we extract those clusters. So the next step would be to go back to corpus linguistics and with a tool that is quite similar to the one that I showed you before to carry out something that is called collocation analysis. This is to say to look for the words that have been more frequently associated to those lists of place names in the clusters. And we believe that through this technique we will be able to solve the question, what is the corpus saying about these places? Does this technique actually work? Well, we are actually looking at it. We haven't gone that far. As I told you before, we are in early stages of the project, so we are just at this stage. But I will certainly tell you next time if it actually works. Right, so the second approach that we wanted to explore, looking at solving the question that we explained before, is precisely to focus on more specific information that we may be interested on. And this is the particular case of the extractions of place names that are related to a specific word. In our case, we wanted to look at occurrences of infant diseases during Victorian times and their rates and their death rates. So we create a very simple map of 7 diseases, or the most important diseases or infant diseases during Victorian times. And with this map, you can also derivate of other maps like the ones that I showed you before, looking at frequency of mentions, for instance, of particular diseases. But even before mapping that, you can also have just creating simple graphics. You can also start to realize or to address very interesting questions in terms of your data. So we graph basically the particular mentions of diseases from this period, and we realize that the word diarrhea, for instance, and the word measles were the diseases that were most mentioned during that period in comparison to dysentery or whooping cough. And looking also at this distribution during the particular decades, we can realize as well that the same word diarrhea came really strongly through the data set in 1960s, while this was particularly the case for diphtheria for 1900s. You can also create other types of graphics looking at the places that have been most associated to particular diseases, such as London. And this was, London was the place that was most associated to the word diarrhea, followed by Edinburgh, Dundee, Leeds, and so on. So you can start to ask particular and very interesting questions from this data set. You can also compare different diseases and look at the distribution of them in particular years of particular decades. And in this specific case, for instance, we have that measles came across quite strongly, or almost the same as strongly as diphtheria in this particular decade in some places, while in some other places it didn't, the occurrences didn't happen the same. And this distribution can also be compared with the number of mentions to the proportional, to actually check if the number of mentions is proportional to the importance of the disease in each decade. And this will allow us to solve what is the corpus saying about these places. And this is quite exciting as well. Looking at the last question that we proposed in the project to solve, was precisely how places represented in the corpus change over time. And there are many different ways to look at this, but one particular methodology that we developed was something that is called expectancy maps. And this was based in another project in which the PI worked before. So what we are looking at here are the particular gains and losses of mentions between 1861 and 1871. What I mean by this is that the green areas were heavily more mentioned in the later year in comparison to the earlier year, while the green areas, while the red areas were less mentioned or came across less mention for the latest year. And the yellow areas remain the same. And this is quite interesting in terms of mention because, and in terms of the change over time analysis, because it allows us to check the emphasis that the Registrar General put in certain geographies during different years. In the same sense, if you were looking at this not in terms of mentions, but in terms of diseases, for instance, it will be also quite interesting to look at different distributions or different changes in the mentions, let's say, of measles, for instance, from one year to another. So another approach to qualitative data as well, such as words describing these diseases that I was telling you about, or even describing landscape, is precisely to graph changes in time or also to map these changes in time. And I brought to you a very simple example of this. So in this particular case, you have a map of several words of sickness that, this is a mock-up test, by the way. This is not real data. So you have basically a series of words that are coming across this particular map for representing 1851 data, and these other sickness words that happened during 1911. So just by the comparison of the two maps, you cannot really work out the difference between them. I mean, you can see a little bit of the changes that might happen in this area, but just by visually comparing them, this is not a very useful map. So one of the things that you can do is carrying out change over time analysis. You can create graphs comparing those particular maps. And in this case, for instance, we're looking at this particular disease that actually seemed to have lost significance between one year and another, while Black Death, for instance, became more common towards 1911. We can also look at the contributions to net change in particular words or in particular diseases in this case. And what I mean by that is that we can look at the most and least replaces diseases by another particular disease, in this case malaria. So syphilis, for instance, was the most replaced disease by malaria geographically, while tuberculosis, for instance, was the less replaced by malaria. We can also see another graphic that is quite close to the map that I was showing you before in terms of percentage changes. So in this map, in this graph, we can actually see how lung fever, for instance, and influenza are quite dynamic words, and they were losing mentions in parts of the geography, but they were also gaining mentions in other parts of the geography as well. So another way of approaching this is to map these total changes. And in here we see a map of the total changes of all these diseases. And again, this map is not that useful in terms just of visualizing it, but it is useful in terms of what we call intermediate results, because it's a map that will help us in further calculations, for instance, or in further comparisons to analyze the changes in these particular diseases. So we can actually map the transition, for instance, from the biggest contributor to change, which was Black Death, as we saw in the previous graph. And we can map then the transition from all the diseases to Black Death between one year and another. And in a way, we can start to devise a certain map here, where parts of the changes seems to cluster quite a lot in these parts of the map. And to actually test that, we can do a further exploration analyzing the trend of change, mapping the spatial trend from all the words to Black Death. And the result of this will give us a very specific or very simple graphic showing us that Black Death was concentrated in these particular areas. This is to say, in the northwest and the and the southwest of the map. Right, so this is only one of the ways to look at changes over time in the analysis of text, and this is only one of the examples that we are working with in the actual project. We will be also looking in the future to 19th century newspapers collection from the British Library. And in this particular collection, we are going to be looking at the perceptions of media and crime. This is to say, we are going to be mapping the distributions of words, for instance, such as murder and other crimes as well. And we are going to look at the perception of media into these events. We are going to also analyze the literature of the Lake District during the 18th and early 19th century. And we are going to be looking at the perception of place and space between different authors. Another particular exciting area that is opening up with this kind of methodology is precisely historical archaeology. And in this case, we are planning to look at the history of the sugar industry and slavery during colonial times in Mexico. The way that this kind of methodology can be useful in historical archaeology is precisely that we do not necessarily in archaeology have all the information about where, in this case, for instance, particular haciendas or sugar production places were placed in colonial times. So looking at the actual records of these places can be helpful also to identify them in the archaeological record. Finally, I would like to do a little bit of shameless self-promotion, and I would like to invite you to go to our website. We are a very active research team, and you can look in there for all the research that we are doing. We are uploading also some learning materials quite soon. We will be running courses and workshops, so please keep in touch. We are very excited about the possibility also of collaborations, so you are very welcome to contact us whenever you want. Thank you for listening.